now recording as well. So I think we're ready to begin. And so welcome everybody to our 15th Kurdish Tuesday. I'm Sarah Glynn. I think perhaps this is the last time I can say that I'm co-convener of Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan, since, as many of you know, I've moved to France and it's a little difficult to be co-convener of Scottish Solidarity from here, I guess. So we're very pleased this evening, to welcome Steve Sweeney, who's international editor of the Morning Star and founder of Journalists for Democracy in Kurdistan. He has a long, rather hair-raising history of reporting from Turkey. Last time, I believe he wasn't allowed further than Istanbul airport. More recently, he's been visiting South Kurdistan, including the Kandil Mountains and Mahmur Camp, and he's currently basing himself in Slimani. So when we invited Steve, the idea was really to focus on problems of reporting on Kurdish issues. So both the crackdown on press freedom in Turkey and the record number of journalists in prison in Turkey, but also the problems of getting out alternative news stories that the world powers don't really want to hear. And I think, any of you like me, if you Google a recent event in that part of the world, you find all those stories from Turkish media and other government-approved media, but nothing ever turns up on Google from the Kurdish media or from the Kurdish perspective, apart from the odd little bits that slip through into mainstream stuff. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it's not appearing on Google, and you have to know where to look. Anyway, I hadn't realized that Steve was off again, covering another story that much of the establishment wants to ignore, or wants to see only from the side of their friends in government in Turkey and in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So tonight, Steve will be able to update us on the tensions in South Kurdistan and the fears that Turkey, with the backing of the US, will succeed in encouraging the ruling KDP, led by the Barzani family, into an intra-Kurdish war against the PKK and the mountain bases that the PKK have been established in for 40 years. There have been calls for peace and unity from across Kurdish society, including from the KDP's partner in government, the PUK, and these need to be backed up by international calls. As Niloufer Koç of the KNK, the Kurdish National Congress, explained in an interview with Conor Hayes for Peace in Kurdistan, and you can see it on the Peace in Kurdistan website, this could be both devastating for the Kurds, of course, and also lead to even more foreign intervention and war in the whole region and beyond. If Turkey and Trump succeed in their attempt at divide and rule, they'll destroy a major force for democracy and a bulwark against Islamofascism. So the world needs to know about this. So thank you, Steve, for being there, and thank you for being with us this evening. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honour and pleasure to be here. And thank you for hosting me. It's great to be in Slimani. For those of you that don't know, this is a city in Bashur in what is known as Iraqi Kurdistan. It's a wonderful city. It's a historical city of great writers and poets. So it's an ideal place for me to be based as a journalist. Just a little bit of background, I guess, for people that don't know and aren't aware of the history. I mean, the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, this drive to war being led by the KDP, hasn't just appeared overnight. It has a very, very long and deep history, which obviously we haven't got time to go into all of it. But the basics are. Just the basics of Bashur are that really it's divided into two spheres. So you have the KDP, which is the largest party in the Kurdish regional government, which is run by the Barzani family, and they really control the north part of Bashur, including the capital Erbil, Duhok province, and Zako, which border Turkey, the mountainous region that borders Turkey. And then on the other side, in the south, you have the PUK as the main sphere of influence, run by the Talabani family, and they control most of the south, including Slimani, Halabja, Garmian, and Rania, which is a city which is considered really the gateway to Kandil, where the PKK has high levels of support, and it has a number of bases there. And it's worth saying as well at this stage, when we're moving closer to this deadly intra-Kurdish civil war, that it wasn't too long ago, in fact, in the mid-1990s, during the last intra-Kurdish civil war, that the KDP allied themselves with Saddam Hussein, and to drive the PUK at the time out of Erbil. And during that conflict, up to, well, at least 30,000 people were killed. This has been admitted by both of the main parties. Many thousands of people remain missing. Their bodies are unaccounted for, and 30,000 is a conservative estimate on the numbers that were killed during that conflict. So this is what's at stake here. This is incredibly serious, and this is why stopping what would certainly be more bloodshed is so important, and why people across the region, in not just in Bashur but across the Middle East and internationally, are doing all that they can to avert war and avert more bloodshed. So it's absolutely critical that we amplify those voices at this stage. Many of you will know that Kandil has recently been targeted by Turkish airstrikes, and this is an ongoing campaign by Turkey, which frequently bombs the area. And according to President Erdogan of Turkey, everybody that lives in the Kandil region is a terrorist. And I can say, because I visited the area, that this is not true. And people, many of them working in workers, shepherd, herding cattle, herding sheep. In fact, the very first meeting that I went to when we arrived in Kandil, we were surrounded by, or met by, a delegation of cows, which was the welcoming party that we had there. So, I mean, this is an area as well, Kandil, of outstanding beauty and nature. There's pomegranates hanging from the trees, and the honey there from the region is the best that I've tasted. It sells very well in markets across Bashur. But this has been made much harder because life in the region is very, very difficult, because local officials told me when I was there that that there's what really amounts to a blockade imposed by the KDP, and it means that essential goods and essential services is difficult for them to enter the region. And the region runs along the lines of it's an autonomous self-governing region, run along the lines of democratic confederalism, with the teachings of Abdullah Öcalan, which many of you will be familiar with. But the KDP at the moment is seeking to blame Turkey for all the problems of the Kandil region. They've made numerous statements saying that it's the PKK that are refusing to allow villagers to repair buildings that have been damaged in the bombing, and to repair other essential buildings. And in a very inflammatory statement last week, which one of the Kurdish peace mothers at a demonstration last week said was like pouring petrol on a fire. Barzani, who still leads, he's a dominating figure in the region, and of course is still the leader of the KDP. He made some very inflammatory statements when he referred to the PKK as an invading force and occupiers, demanding that they leave the area. Now, this posed many questions, and it's upset quite a large number of people. Actually, is the main question really being how can Kurds invade their own country? And many politicians, many commentators, and myself included, I guess, amongst these, are saying, well, Kurdistan belongs to all Kurds, and it's not up to one single family or even a political party to decide who can and cannot live there, and who is or isn't isn't Kurdish. And while it is true that hundreds of villages have been evacuated over the past few decades, and many people have been forced to flee the area, the cause isn't the PKK. The cause of this, quite clearly, is the Turkish jets that are flying overhead and dropping NATO and British bombs onto the civilian population below. And I've witnessed this firsthand myself when I was in Kandil recently. And for those of you, you probably don't know, but non-Kurds are not allowed into the region, and it's controlled by a series of checkpoints. Now, there's checkpoints all the way across Kurdistan for security reasons, and not unreasonably, given the security situation in the country, and in particular in the region. And it's why the Kurdistan region was one of the safest during the period where ISIS swept to power across large parts of the Middle East. But in order to get into Kandil, I had to disguise myself as a Kurdish farmer and snake my way across the mountains to gain entry. Now, as we were making our way into the region, at one point my guide stopped suddenly and we changed direction, and I asked him, he was very casual about this, but we were in a cave. We sort of stopped in a cave very briefly, and I said, what's happening? And he said, what's the word in English? There's an ambush waiting for us over the ridge of the mountain. And he'd luckily had reception and got some radio contact from friends who alerted us to the fact that there were Iranian forces waiting over the ridge of the mountain, and it wasn't very far away. So I asked him, well, what would they have done if they'd have seen us? And he just casually replied, they would have shot us, and then carried on walking along the route. But it was a very, very sharp reminder, actually, of the fact that this is a war zone, and it's not just Turkey that is bombing the area, but the Iranian forces are also allied with the KDP as part of this security deal that was, I think in September, the US said, well, the three of you, Turkey, Iran, and the KDP, must work together in order to counter the PKK. So I met many people when I was there, many local people that have been affected by the bombing, by Turkish bombing raids. I even held a fragment of a missile that was dropped and wiped out one woman's entire family. And she told me that the bombing started at about 4 a.m. during just in time for prayers. And at that time, her mother was in another room praying, and she's a Muslim, and she was taking part in prayers. And when the missiles struck, and then she said there was darkness, explosions, and chaos. And I mean, it was a very traumatic conversation that we had. And she said that when she went into the room, she found that her mother had been cut in half, sliced in two by the bomb. And she was indignant, obviously, at Erdogan, saying he poses as a good Muslim man and the leader of Muslims, and here he is launching bombing raids during prayers. And in fact, she told me that bombing in the region normally starts on a Thursday, as people are to prevent people from returning to the region on Friday, which is the start of the weekend and the holy day for the Islamic week. But 7 members of her family were wiped out during that bombing raid, and she said the village shook for hours. It was shaking during this, and she believes that Turkey may have used chemical weapons during this attack, and it's not the first time that these accusations have been made. And she told me that her family prays every night that they're not going to be bombed and killed in their sleep, and remain deeply traumatized by their experiences, frightened every time a plane goes overhead. I witnessed this myself, actually. I was staying with a family in Rania, and they heard an aeroplane, and everybody ran outside to see what was happening. And it was not out of excitement of seeing a plane; it was about fear that bombs were going to be dropped. And just to give another indication, there was another woman that I spoke to in the village, and she said that her friend's husband was killed by Saddam Hussein during his tyrannical rule. Their son was killed by the KDP during the intra-Kurdish conflict, and then she died in a bombing raid, killed by Turkey. So The region's no stranger to war. And they were very clear, though, the people that I spoke to, that nobody helped them. They were completely abandoned. And the only force, united force, that they said that came to their aid and carried out rescue operations and stayed afterwards to assist them with all their other needs was the PKK. And they were the only force in the region that hasn't tried to kill them. And, you know, she said to me these words, I thought they were very sort of poignant, really. She said that the EU and NATO weapons are being used on us. The whole world is killing us, but we don't know why. We have suffered decades of attempted genocides of our people. And that's, you know, pretty much what's happening in Kurdistan. It is a genocide. And I asked people about the PKK, and I spoke to many people, farm workers, shepherds, shopkeepers, and all of them said the same thing, that the PKK are not terrorists. The PKK are fighting for the freedom of the Kurdish people. I spoke to one of their cadres in the Kandil region, and he said, look, you know what, we're fighting. Our language has been oppressed. Our political parties are being oppressed. Our traditions, our culture are being oppressed. We're being killed in Bakur, in Turkey, in Rojava, in Syria, and what are we supposed to do? We can't just sit back and take it. We have to fight back. And we know the crimes that have been committed against the Kurdish people. For those of you that haven't seen it, the Permanent People's Tribunal ruling in the European Court is worth looking at, because it documents this very clearly, the atrocities that have been committed, and it recommended that Turkey and Erdogan and other leading government officials are charged with war crimes, and they're put on trial in Turkey. And it's a very interesting read, as is the judgment, the Belgian court case about whether the PKK are a terrorist organisation or not, and they said not. So those two things are very well worth looking back at. And I was talking to somebody in the region recently, and they said, look, the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, the background, there's the very real threat of a civil war, but it's deeply rooted, and it goes back a long way, and it has its roots in imperialism. And the civil war is being pressed not just by the KDP but by the US and Turkey, and both of those nations have overlapping interests. The US is opposed to the ideology of the PKK, the ideology of democratic confederalism, the ideology of socialism, call it what you want, but they don't want to see the spread of the PKK either in Bashur, in Iraqi Kurdistan, or in Rojava, or indeed anywhere else in the Middle East. And this is what they want to prevent. While Turkey, of course, wants the freedom to continue its genocide of the Kurdish people. And we have to say that it's being given a free hand to do so, acting not just with impunity, but with the explicit support of NATO, the EU, the US, and other imperialist forces, including the British government. They continue to sell it weapons and trade with Ankara, despite the crackdown in Turkey as well on democracy, the jailing of journalists, the jailing of HDP politicians, the removal of elected mayors, etc. And we know that the situation there, but this is completely normalised, and there's not. Nobody is speaking out, and what Turkey's jailing and even killing political opponents. In Rojava, we witnessed last year the brutal extrajudicial execution of Hevrin Kalev, who was killed by Turkish-backed jihadists last October. And I cited Erdogan for war crimes, actually. He came to open a mosque in Cambridge, and I went to the police station there and with a file documenting the war crimes committed by Erdogan, as outlined in the Permanent People's Tribunal, the Rojava Information Centre's information, but also cited the execution of Hevrin Kalev. But these things, you look at the crimes. Women are being kidnapped and kept in rape and torture camps in Afrin. We have the Shengol genocide, which was carried out by ISIS, but the world closes its eyes and turns the other way. And this isn't, sadly, this isn't just the usual suspects. I mean, we expect it from Tories, and we expect it from the right wing, and we expect it from imperialists, because they're not just turning away, they're encouraging these things. But it's also the left and social democracy. The Labour Party in Britain, for example, has completely failed to speak out against these crimes. And if Turkey or the KDP were another country, that they wanted regime change in, was probably that they would be speaking out. They would be calling for sanctions. They would stop normalising relations and trade and maybe stopping arms sales, probably not. But they would make this. There would be a lot more. Vocal about this kind of thing. So, where are we now? Well, we look in August start going back a little bit further in. Earlier, Turkey launched Operation Claw Eagle, which was its campaign against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. And this is what they said it was, but they were bombing, of course, not just PKK targets, but during that operation, they bombed the Mahmur refugee camp, which I'll talk about in a few moments. They bombed Shengal, which was the site of the Yazidi genocide, where thousands of men and boys were massacred, and thousands of women and girls were taken and sold into sexual slavery. I think more than 3,000 are still missing. But during that campaign as well, they bombed a resort about 30 minutes drive from here called Kunamasi, and I visited Kunamasi a few weeks ago, and this is a resort that is very popular in the region. It's really beautiful. It's set in the mountains, and it attracts tourists not just from Kurdistan, but also from Iraq. As we were there was a busload of people from Basra. There were people from Baghdad, people from Rojava, Iran, had arrived to enjoy the last of the summer sun. It's absolutely beautiful. But I met the family that were affected by the bombing there. So Turkey bombed with a drone. They think it was a drone. They're not entirely sure because it all happened so quickly. Whilst holidaymakers and children were, the bomb caused. The man that I met said that he spoke to his uncle as he was collecting money for the people that were staying there. They rent out parts of the resort, and he said, "We're going to have a good day today." And he said about an hour later, the area was a complete bloodbath, and this Turkish drone missile had struck the area. Luckily, the children escaped. Most of them escaped unharmed. There was a man that was killed that they decided was a member of the PKK, even though they provided no evidence to back this. He was killed. But the man that I met, his uncle, was very, very badly injured with shrapnel, and his wife Payman, they'd just come to visit the shop at the resort, had her leg blown off. And I met with them. I met with the family afterwards. I met with Payman, and she was very critical of this lack of particularly of Britain. Actually, she said the government doesn't care. It's a government based on greed that doesn't care about people. They don't see the consequences of continuing to sell arms and weapons to the Turkish state. But this is the result. Their lives have changed forever on that day, in the blink of an eye. She now has to go to hospital, and so does her husband. Every single day they're going to hospital for treatment. They have to pay for that treatment because there's no free healthcare here. She can't get a prosthetic leg because it would cost about £50,000, but they can't even do that. She'd have to leave the country to get that treatment. The children, when I was there, were crying. One of the young boys was crying because of noise that he heard. He's absolutely traumatized. He was thrown through the air when the missile struck, and this is ruined their lives. They can't work anymore, and they've had to sell their house and stay with relatives, and nobody's helping them. In fact, one of the local officials went on television and said, yes, I'll do all I can to support them. I'll pay for all of their treatment. But then once he'd made the TV appearances, when it came down to the reality, he backed away. And the reason was that the family criticised him on social media. And because they criticised him, he said, "You made a fool of me, and I'm not supporting you anymore." So, I mean, when it comes to British arms sales, there's a very, very real human cost to this. So, one of the other areas that they bombed was Macklemore. For those of you that don't know Macklemore, Macklemore is a refugee camp that was set up in the 1990s. This was following. They're mainly people from Bashur, from Turkey, that had fled state assimilation operations. This was when thousands of villages, about 3,000 villages, were burnt to the ground, and they were forced out across the border into Bashur. And they had various camps set up. They were attacked by KDP, Peshmerga, and many of them were killed. And they eventually settled in Macklemore, which sits in one of the contested areas of. They have the Article 140, which is the contested areas between the Iraqi central government and Kurdistan. But this is targeted because, according to President Erdogan, it's an incubator of terrorism. And he, because some of the people that there support PKK, he believes that they're all terrorists. Now, there's 12,000 people living there. I lived among them for 8 days, and it's a really amazing functioning society, actually. And they point out that they're not economic refugees; they're political refugees, and they're being persecuted because of this. But they have a system, again, run along the lines of democratic confederalism. And I met health workers, education workers, cultural workers. I mean, the local administration, the women's organisations there, which the primacy, they stress the primacy of women in everything, all aspects of society there. And I mean, this is probably a topic for another meeting, really, of how that camp runs. But the camp has been under a blockade for nearly 18 months now. And the reason that it's been under a blockade, it's a KDP-imposed blockade, is allegedly they said that the residents from Macklemore were involved in the shooting. And this is where reporting, how issues are reported, comes into play. Because if you listen to some of the Kurdish, some of the regional press organisations and the international press, they'll say that a Turkish diplomat was shot dead in Erbil, the regional capital. But it wasn't simply a Turkish diplomat. It was a Turkish intelligence agent from MIT, from the National Intelligence Organization. And they were indeed shot dead. But of course, the move was to blame PKK with no evidence. The move was to blame people from the Macklemore camp, again, with no evidence. So they imposed a blockade, which, as I pointed out to, a blockade of such a type is illegal. It's illegal under international law, which legislates against collective punishment. And this is exactly the kind of thing that the Israelis do to Palestinians, of course. But it's happening in Macklemore. And the blockade is happening at a time when there's a deadly coronavirus pandemic, which has now reached the camp. I wrote an article about this in the Morning Star if you want to read that. But they're very, very. The blockade means that aid and resources cannot get into the camp. People are not allowed to leave the camp. And when I contacted the United Nations, because it's a United Nations administered camp, they denied that there was a blockade. They denied that there was any restrictions other than the COVID restrictions. They also denied that the camp had been bombed. They said they hadn't had any reports. It took me 2 weeks to get an answer out of them, of relentless. Every day I sent them 3 or 4 emails and phone calls every single day just to get them to answer some basic questions. And they denied knowledge of a bombing raid. This is, which is barely credible because it was all over the press. I've seen the reports sent by camp officials about the bombing raid, but the Turkish armed forces admitted to doing it. It was on, there was a statement on their website saying that they did it in a bid to neutralize terrorists. They just didn't think that there was anything wrong with it. So, as a journalist, it's my absolute duty to tell the truth. And and this is this was this is a crime against this is a crime against humanity. What's happening in Makmur. So they targeted Makmur, and I've spoken to people there again very recently this week, and they've reported that Turkish jets are flying overhead, drones are flying overhead. This was something that I saw every night when I was there. You heard it became a familiar sound. The sound of drones flying overhead, but now they've said that there's Turkish jets, and they believe that they're going to be bombed, anytime soon. Shengal, which we know, is the site of the horrendous Yazidi genocide, which I've already spoken about. There were airstrikes on Shengal just last week. And these are all critical positions in terms of the goals of imperialism, because they, like I said, they sit in the contested areas, and there's this drive to create there's a drive to create a wedge or a Sunni corridor, really. And as you know, with the Shengal, by the way, there was a security deal reached behind the backs of the Yazidi people very recently, in which a new unelected mayor was imposed on Shengal, and this person hasn't even lived in the country for the last 7 years. And this was a deal stitched up between the KDP and Baghdad, but it was made at the behest of Turkey, and it was made at the behest of the US, and they want to divide the Kurdish movement in Bashur, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and Rojava, Iran, and they want to divide them and from the Kurdish movement in Rojava, and that's very clearly the kind of the direction of travel. But I mean, the war at the moment is being met by mass opposition. So there's demonstrations almost on a daily basis in the region. And this is one thing that is really important to note, that the only party and the only organisation in the region that supports the war is the KDP. So, as Sarah said in her introduction, it's opposed by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the second largest party. It's opposed by the Goran movement. It's opposed by the Communist Party of Kurdistan. It's opposed by all other forces. And the movement of thousands of Peshmerga forces into the region is not sanctioned by the Kurdistan regional government. They've bypassed the Kurdistan regional government because there's no support there. Speaking to people on the ground, there's no support on the ground either. People don't want to see a war, quite obviously, because they remember what it was like before, and the thousands and thousands of people that have died. So there's these huge demonstrations. That I've attended a number of them. The first one I attended last week was a demand for peace and unity, and it was organised by the Kurdish movement and in Slimani. And when I turned up there, it wasn't a massive demonstration. It was the kind of thing that you might see in Britain. So, but there were banners calling for peace and no war. There were local politicians that attended to give speeches. But we were surrounded by more than 60 armed police officials, and all of they were carrying machine guns, and behind them, this was what people were telling me then, behind them were intelligence operatives who were monitoring the people that were at the demonstration. Now, I saw people in plain clothes talking to the police, so I assume that they could be right in their fears, but they wouldn't let the demonstration move. It was a static demonstration. Just down the road is the KDP have an office in Slimani, and they prevented them from moving towards towards that. I was speaking to a PKK guerrilla fighter earlier this week who described the situation as a third world war. in the Middle East, and with its roots in imperialism. And a few days ago, I can't even remember what day it is today, last week anyway, there was a demonstration by Kurdish peace mothers, and their voices were very, very powerful. These are women from across the region, across Kurdistan, and actually there was one from Mosul and from other areas. And these are all people that have lost sons in the intra-Kurdish war. And they made an emotional appeal to the Peshmerga forces to say, look, we don't want any more mothers to suffer as we have, and we don't want any more tears, the tears of any more mothers, and we don't want another mother to be told that her son has been killed. And said, you're our Kurdish brothers, and we're appealing to you for unity and to stop the war. And these are kind of the voices really that need to be amplified at the moment. It was incredibly powerful. There was a number of women that gave very strong speeches, and again, you can read the report of the demonstration in the Morning Star. But it's also worth noting that there's like I said, the main parties are united for peace and unity. So this is really being driven by one, and I would hazard a guess actually by one person, or one family, the Barzani family, because I imagine that there are, even inside the KDP, I imagine that there's not unity over this drive to war. It's worth noting at this stage, and again, not really time to explore this point too much further, but I will be writing on this, that the KRG at the moment is in a really dire economic state. I mean, I was going to warn that there is a possibility that the electricity might be cut during this meeting, but public sector workers haven't been paid since March. Schools are closed, public services are not really functioning, and there's this dispute over the budget and over oil revenue. So there's a really dire economic situation, and the same in Turkey. It has to be said as well. The economy is plummeting. The value of the lira is in free fall. So when these kind of things happen, the leaders of these places tend to drive to war, to divert away from the domestic issues that they're facing. So the emergency budget has been vetoed. I think there was a meeting on Sunday, and of course the root of all of this really is what sparked the war in Iraq, but it's also what's sparking the current situation now, in a way, with the mountains region, where with the PKK, and they're saying that everywhere the PKK has something set up, then the Peshmerga forces suddenly arrive there. And Murat Karaylan has been very clear that that we don't want a war. They're doing everything that they can to avoid the war, and luckily his call are being backed by opposition forces. But it's looking pretty. They don't seem to be listening, and they don't seem to be reading back at the moment. There was a recent report from the Kurdistan Regional Security Council, or it was alleged to have come from them. This is part of, I've just come onto the propaganda war that we're fighting at the moment, because this report claimed that 17 supporters of the PKK had been arrested, linked to a plot to carry out attacks on government buildings, on Peshmerga forces, on other officials, in a bid to destabilize the region. Now, this was posted as and reported in the media as an official report, but the problem is that 3 of the 5 members on that committee are members of the PUK, and they said, well, we have no knowledge of this at all. We have no knowledge of this report. We are not aware of any arrests being made, and said that they disputed it and said that this is not an officially sanctioned document from that committee. So people, the KDP are clearly abusing these, these structures to try and make out as though that these are official security reports when they're not. But this isn't being reported, of course. This is being ignored by most of the press, and we reported it in the Morning Star. But this propaganda war is being waged quite brutally. Critical voices are being oppressed. Journalists are being detained and jailed. Some of them, there's a journalist, an Iraqi journalist called Iraqi Kurdish journalist called Sweeney. Jeremy Corbyn recently wrote to Barzani, demanding information about his safety and well-being. Just today, it's emerged that he has been tortured. He was taken, I think, in October in a raid on his house, in front of his family, in front of his children, and he was taken off without any charges being levelled against him, without any knowledge of why he was being detained. But now he's been tortured, and they've extracted a confession out of him that he was involved in a plot to carry out an attack in Erbil. We've seen the NRT, which is a TV channel. They had their offices earlier this year in Erbil and Duhok shut down. So the message that is coming out of the region at the moment is being very, very carefully managed. And if we're fighting through the news from news organisations like Rudao and Kurdistan 24, who are publishing on a daily basis now anti-PKK propaganda. And I call it propaganda because these are, the PKK are being blamed for all sorts of things like killings, attacks on Peshmerga forces, plots to destabilise the region and attack government buildings, all of which PKK is denying, by the way, but they're never saying that, they're never getting this message across. And it's really trying to sway, not just public opinion, because they're losing that battle here quite clearly. There's no support for the war here, but I think internationally they're trying to soften up support for their actions and prevent any kind of protests or criticism from international government. So the drums for war are beating ever louder, and despite the opposition from the people, all political parties. And Turkey, again, like I said, has been continuing its bombing raids, in the region, which is, KDP are accused of doing Turkey's dirty work for them. And as we know, Barzani has a very good relationship with Tayyip Erdogan. People joke and say that Barzani is like Tayyip's little brother. And that Tayyip's pulling his strings, which, there's a lot of truth in that, but then who's pulling Erdogan's strings? And Erdogan's strings are being pulled by the US and imperialism and imperialist forces. So, this is not just simply an intra-Kurdish war. It has to be stressed that this is an imperialist war. And it's being waged on the region. I have to say, even in this city, in Slimani, this is a city of 1.2 million people, so I'm reliably told. But this is a major city in the south of the region, and we're having drones flying overhead. This is to a blanket silence as well. Nobody's speaking out about this. This is a major city, a peaceful city. And drones are flying overhead. I've heard them. And this is because Erdogan says that this is a stronghold of the PKK, has a lot of PKK support, but also it's to intimidate, not just intimidate the people, but also to intimidate the PUK. And what it wants to do is drive a wedge between the PKK, the PUK, and just to splinter Kurdish unity. That's Erdogan's goal, and he can say, look, the region is unstable. Kurds can't govern themselves. And we're right to do what we're doing. It's worth noting as well that in Britain there is an all-party parliamentary group on Iraqi Kurdistan. There's another one which is slightly better on, which covers, I think, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. But there's one on Iraqi Kurdistan, which has also failed to speak out. Despite recently, if you look at the website, I mean, I strongly urge you to do so, to look at the website, look at their Twitter account, and it boasts of the strong links it has developed with the Kurdistan regional government. I've asked them, well, if you have such strong links, that's to be welcomed, but you need to use those links to raise your voice against the war and to exert pressure on the Kurdistan regional government and the KDP to roll back from their actions. I haven't received a response from them. I'm not overly surprised. I'm not overly surprised at that. But if you look at their website, I looked at it just before the meeting started, and I was talking to my Kurdish friend here, and he was appalled to see what it was saying. It was essentially praising the KDP and the KRG and the Peshmerga forces for the fight against ISIS and for bringing stability to the region, which is the opposite of what's happening on the ground. And this matters actually. And if people are here and can do something to raise their voice and challenge this, because this is the face of Bashur in Parliament, they presented a parliamentary motion, and please have a look at that to say to talk about how great the KRG is, but it just needs to diversify its economy and not be so reliant on oil, and look at agriculture and tourism. I mean, who's going to come here as a tourist when there's the threat of war? And talking about diversifying the economy, just give them their oil back and stop stealing it. I mean, that's it's rich in oil. Kurdistan's a rich region. It should be it shouldn't be suffering the economic hardship that it is, but it's doing so because of the after effects of the 2003 invasion and the mismanagement by the KDP, and of course the involvement of the private sector, the big oil companies who have been rubbing their hands at this. But really, the only thing that the all-party parliamentary group should be doing, as should anybody now, is raising their voices and using whatever influence they have to stop the war and prevent this bloodbath. So, I mean, it comes to the point now. We know this, how bad the situation is, and I think I've explained in just a small, just given a snapshot really of what's happening here. But the point is, what do we do about it? That's always, the important thing to stress. And partly we need to cut through the propaganda, and we need to cut through all of the misinformation that is coming out of the region, deliberately coming out of the region. So, please read the Morning Star. Obviously, I'm going to say that, but I mean, I'm writing here from the ground every day, and you can get a reliable update on the reality of the situation here. But if we can come out with, or any organisations can come out with, a strong anti-war statement, I think that would be really, really helpful. And if we can circulate that around any kind of trade union branches, political organisations, etc., it's going to be really helpful. Speak to your MPs. All of you will have one, whether they're good or not. But speak to your MP. That it's their job. Get them to raise their voices and raise concerns in Parliament about the war. Get your trade union branch to speak out. Get your constituency Labour Party, your SNP branch, or whatever, Green Party, or whatever organisation you belong to raise its voice, and get involved with the Scottish solidarity with Kurdistan if you're based in Scotland. Otherwise, get involved with the Kurdistan Solidarity Campaign. Support the Freedom for Öcalan campaign. This is again another important campaign to be involved with. I didn't really have time to touch on that, but that's another thing that's been, the importance of that has been stressed by people. But take the anti-war message out onto the streets, take it into the workplaces, take it into our communities, and let's stop this war. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that it's really frightening that so few people in the wider world really recognise at all what's happening, actually.
Yeah.
So, do we have questions from anybody here? Yes, from Neil. Do you want to unmute yourself, Neil?
Hi there. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining us this evening. It's been very interesting to hear your talk there. Very informative. my question really is almost, well, not quite a personal one, but for you professionally as a journalist, and I wonder how embedded in the journalist community you are where you are, and how much of a journalist community there actually is, and whether there are journalists who are active from other countries around Europe, from France and Germany and Spain and Italy as well, and if there is any movement amongst you, if such a network exists to try and get news out. And also, I just wonder if you've got any connections news-wise with what's happening in Afrin, because it seems to me as though we're looking at a situation where Turkey is trying to expand throughout the region. They've virtually annexed the northwest part of Syria now, and I wonder if you had any comments or any news about that. Does coverage appear in the Morning Star about that area as well?
Yes. Do you want me to answer that now, Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's actually a very good question, and just to answer your question about whether there are any other international journalists here, the short answer to that is no. There aren't, and not that I'm aware of, not that I've seen. And those that do come over tend to they'll come over as official guests of the Barzani led government, and they'll have a very kind of managed experience here rather than going out and doing some of the silly things people say that I might do. But as a journalist, my role is to shine a light into dark places. It's to tell the truth, and it's to try and amplify the voices of the people that I met in Kandil, in Makmur, and all of these other areas. Really, the journalist community is almost as divided as the political community here, in that you have the influence of the Barzani KDP in the north and the Talabani in the south. And of course, these aren't, they're not stupid. They have fully funded and owned media companies which dominate the airwaves, and they dominate the social media. So they really control that message. Like I said, the kind of journalists that speak out in certainly in Kurdistan find themselves in prison. If you criticize Barzani in particular, then you end up in jail. Like I mentioned, Sherwan Sherwani, but there's a list, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're talking scores of journalists that have been and activists that have been jailed just very recently in the build up to the war. There are people doing some really good work, and there's an organisation, news organisation called Ciwan Nuce, and I'll spell it out. It's CIWAN space NUCE, Ciwan Nuce, and they are based here, but they're also based in Rojava as well, and they are really doing some fantastic work. But the difficulty that they face is one of they're running on a shoestring. They have because so they're battling against these big kind of media organisations, but they're the ones that are really on the ground and telling getting good reliable information. And I use them as a resource if I need to cross-reference something. So we're actually raising funds for them to buy basic equipment. They haven't even got a laptop at the moment that broke, and they can't afford to replace it because and cameras. So again, I'll speak to Sarah, but we're running an appeal to raise funds for them. So it's very, very difficult. So I mean, I came here because partly for that reason, because I think that that news needs to break through into the British press as well, not just internationally that currently exist. In the Morning Star, occupying force in the region with jihadist groups, and there's war crimes committed on a daily basis there. We've seen the chemical weapons attacks that again in Serikanya that were ignored. We reported about it and again pressed for investigations, and I contacted the organisation for the prohibition of chemical weapons, and they initially started investigations into this, but then they said, oh, it's not in our remit. What their remit is regime change in Syria to get rid of Assad, so they'll start that's their kind of their focus, but they're not interested in Turkish chemical attacks. And there was one in Afrin where they invited inspectors to come into the hospital. I mean, I saw the video footage. I saw the victims, of this. It's all very, very real. But Washington's response at the time was, "Oh well, they probably didn't do it." When they thought Assad might have done it or might not have done it, they launched airstrikes and against civilians actually. So it's a very difficult situation. But I would say that it's not simply a message of a point of the getting governments to take notice, because they know what's happening. They just don't care. That's the issue. The British government, the Americans, NATO, the European Union, everybody knows exactly what's happening. But they might occasionally make the odd noise saying, "Turkey, you're a bit naughty," but they don't actually do anything about it. They don't take any concrete action or anything that will reel them in. And the reason is because Turkey operates as NATO's battering ram in the Middle East. It's currently engaged in Syria, in Iraq, obviously inside internal repression. In Libya, we saw recently in Nagorno-Karabakh, where we reported this months ago, by the way, that they shipped jihadists into the region. They did it in the summer. And in fact, they did it. We later transpired they'd shipped them in March. So Turkey is somebody said to me that it's really important. The message that you get out is that that Turkey is like Hitler and Turkey is like a fascist state. And they said that the important thing for people to do is isolate it as a pariah state and get your government to stop selling the bombs that are dropping on our people. Yeah, I hope that's kind of answered.
Thank you. Yeah.
Also a bit of a question about Afrin. Did you want to say anything more about Afrin? And then Henify's got his hand up after that.
No, I think I kind of covered a little bit about Afrin with the occupation with jihadist forces, and we're constantly reporting about the torture camps. The Missing Afrin Women project is worth looking at. That's a website that documents all of the women that are being kidnapped. And we reported in, I think, May this year, the discovery of a camp where hundreds of women and young girls were being held. A lot of them Yazidis and Kurdish women, and they were they'd been raped, tortured, and sexually assaulted. And again, complete silence. This is the shocking thing, is this kind of complicity in war crimes, and that's what's happening there. We saw, it's worth mentioning, in Kobani, the airstrikes that targeted 3 Kurdish women, 3 Kurdish politicians. So I mean, this again, which is a war crime, and but the international community they're not just not speaking out; they support it. But yeah, this is an occupation. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Henify, do you want to? And then I've got a question from Stephen, but I don't know why Stephen could ask maybe himself.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much for the very valuable, very informative, and very insightful presentation. And thanks specifically for mentioning that this is not actually if there is going to be a war, hopefully there will not be. But if it happens, it's not an intra-Kurdish war, but it's an imperialist war. And many researchers, journalists, or commentators mostly fail to mention that, to see actually that part of the picture. As someone growing up in Kurdistan, as an Armenian Kurdish or Kurdish Armenian person who grew up in North Kurdistan, you witness things that, you have a perspective of things that, of course, people observing from outside may not see it. But as a researcher, when I started reading about, Kurdish issue in Turkey or Kurdistan, why Kurdistan is not free, why is it, divided between 4 countries, and mostly the comments or the answer will be that, well, the Kurds are very divided, they cannot unite, and that's why they are not free. They will fail to mention that, well, the reason that Kurdistan is divided is basically Cairo Conference of 1921, the British imperialism. And you mentioned like the attacks by Turkey with gas. And the first time the Kurds were gassed for wanting freedom was actually by the British Royal Air Force. So
Yeah.
this is this imperialist part, and researchers or journalists either fail to see this or fail to mention this. And specifically, thanks for that. So, and this question of course, intra-Kurdish wars came when I also had a presentation on 6th October, and before that, Thomas Schmiedinger was here. We also talked about it, and I said, well, we should actually, you know, as researchers, commentators, journalists, stop talking about intra-Kurdish fighting and see the ways they are forced in a way. I mentioned I grew up in Turkish Kurdistan. You also mentioned that 3,000 villages, more than 3,000 villages were burned to the ground. Yes, as a child, I will see day by day certain Kurdish villages will be burned because the people refused to become village guards, you know, Kurdish system,
Yes.
they say. So the Turkish state government will force Kurdish villagers to become either village guards, you know, take up the state from the arms from the state, fight their brothers, or leave their villages, or get killed, worse. And refugees in Mahmur camp are actually from, many of them from those villages that were burned down by Turkey, because they didn't accept to take up arms. So the imperialist mind or the occupation forces don't give you a choice, either die or leave or take up our arms, fight one another. So it's very valuable to mention that. In many cases, if there is a Turkish intra-war, it's because one part of the fight is very desperate. So I wanted to ask you how desperate the KDP is. Is the KDP as desperate as the village guards in Turkey who have no choice but either leave their villages or die or take up the arms? So is the KDP in that position that they have no choice but to bow down before Turkey and say, well, we don't have a choice, we will have to fight the PKK? Is there such a situation, or do you think it's not a matter of to be or not to be for the KDP? They actually want to use this as a manipulation of the reality on the ground. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question, really. But I think, of course, the KDP has a choice. I mean, it very clearly has a choice. But you, and again, this would probably be a meeting on its own. Would be the history of the KDP, and and their role in terms of their history of people are really upset about this. Actually, this is something that's really important to understand. Is people on all sides of the conflict are saying, look, they don't want to fight because we're Kurds and we don't want to fight we don't want to fight other Kurds, and we're ashamed that this is happening, and we really wish that that's why there's a call for peace and unity among Kurds, and to say, look, despite the KDP being operating the way that they do, the KDP isn't really our enemy. Our enemy is Turkey. Our enemy is imperialism and the imperialist forces that, as you said, really created the problems historically, going back to the division of the region by the imperialist forces and the carve up, and the promising of a Kurdish state, and then going back on their word on that kind of thing, perhaps unsurprisingly. But KDP of course has a choice. But there's a very clear ideology here. There's the people that want. I mean, actually, I don't know if the KDP has an ideology. To be perfectly honest with you, it wants to entrench its power. And I think one of the things that it fears very much is the ideology of the PKK, for example, which is spreading whatever you think of democratic confederalism or the PKK really as an organisation. What you can say is that they are bringing like a more kind of democratic system to the region, and I think this frightens the Barzani family and the KDP, because if they were subjected to things like elections, like or there was actually any of the vestiges of democracy, they would lose power. So this is, they rely on, there's a kind of a codependence, I think, on the KDP relies on the imperialist forces to maintain its position of power, power in the region, because if it wasn't backed by Turkey and it wasn't backed by the US and Britain, etc., you could see it crumbling. Because believe me, the Peshmerga forces, it was the PKK that were the people the forces that liberated Makhmur, that liberated Shengal, that defeated ISIS in the region. It wasn't, the Peshmerga, of course, were involved in that, but it was PKK really that kept peace and stability in the region. Barzani recognised that, because in 2014 he thanked the PKK for their operations and said, you are our brothers. This was only 6 years ago. You are our brothers, and they agreed these kind of joint. I don't know what the joint operations were, but anti-ISIS operations. But of course, it's always had its eye on places like Kirkuk, which we know about. The 2017 referendum, which backfired on them spectacularly because it upset their imperialist backers, which really didn't want to see this. It angered Turkey, it angered the US. So they got a bit of a slap on the wrist, I think, over that, which led to Barzani pulling back a little bit. But whether I think this is about power and power of the KDP maintaining its grip on the region. Of course it has a choice, but it chooses to ally itself with the forces of imperialism. So this mutually dependent relationship is the KDP rely on the forces of imperialism to keep themselves in power, and the forces of imperialism rely on the KDP to act as its battering ram and its tool of oppression in the region. And of course, at the bottom of it all, as always, is oil. This is as it ever is. Within the oil-rich regions of the KDP will happily open the door and roll out the red carpets to the likes of Halliburton and BP and Esso and Exxon Mobil and whoever to exploit the resources of the country and keep it as it is at the moment. I find it astonishing, really, that with the amount of oil in the region, that the country's so poor. And it can't pay its public sector workers, it can't pay its teachers, it can't pay its police officers, it can't pay its hospital workers, and we're subjected to regular power cuts, and people are really struggling to get by. And there's no reason that should be happening here. But I'm not an expert, but that's my kind of view from the ground, I suppose, on how I see it. But I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Steve. So I've got a question from Stephen, who's not able to use his mic at the moment, asking if you've had any contact there with any trade unions, and what's their political orientation and how strong they are. I don't know if you heard that because you've frozen. Will you unfreeze?
Hello?
Hello? Did you hear the question, Steve?
Yeah, sorry. No, I didn't. Have I had any contact with?
When I was asking it, it's from Stephen. So have you had any contact with trade unions there? And if so, what is their orientation, their political orientation, and how strong are they?
The trade union movement, I've had very limited contact with the trade union movement. In fact, I'm going to be meeting with the teachers tomorrow. And they're going to be discussing the political situation here. I mean, and again, it depends on the area. The unions, the relative strength of the unions is actually not that great. And again, they're divided along political lines, with some unions allied with the Talibanis, some unions allied with the Barzanis. So, I mean, there are pockets of resistance. There's been teacher strikes in Halabja, Slimani, in opposition to the non-payment of salaries. But in general, it's not like, I mean, it's very, very different from how it is in Britain. of course, they're operating under very difficult circumstances, because any opposition to the KRG is met with oppression and arrest, and people are thrown into prison. So hopefully, I mean, I'm hopefully having more of those meetings over the coming weeks, so I'll be able to give a bit more of a picture, a bit more of an informed picture, really, I think, after having those meetings. But certainly, there is that kind of upswell of anger, and like I said, there have been strikes, but on the whole, people are still continuing to work. Society, they want the society to function. The hospitals are still operating, the police force are still doing whatever they do, but despite not being paid. But yeah, I think it's a very difficult situation. But I don't think there's the relative strength compared to somewhere like Britain. Sorry, I can't be any more helpful on that. I'll keep in touch with you, Stephen, actually, on this, and if I get any good contacts, which I will do, then I'll pass them on to you, because it would be probably very useful to foster those links. When I was in Mackmore, actually, the people there wanted to make contacts, and I thought of Unison, because the people there wanted to make contact with other health workers unions, and I know that obviously Unison is the largest trade union for health workers, as I understand, and I think it would be good, actually, to put you in touch with some of those people there. I mean, what they're saying is that they're desperately short of aid and equipment, but they also need the political support, not just the practical support.
Thanks very much. Do we have any more? I can think of lots of questions. Oh, I'm going to ask one then. Obviously, the private oil companies are really important there and powerful, and I wondered if they have intervened at all in the politics of moving towards war.
Well, not overtly, they haven't, and they would be quite unwise, I think, if they were to be open about their motivations in this. But as always, it's the big oil companies and big business and that pull the strings. And I very much imagine that they are exerting pressure on Barzani as well, because the oil trade is absolutely crucial, and we know that oil comes through Iraqi Kurdistan, and there were, of course, rumours that Barzani was using ISIS oil and trading ISIS oil as well. These are this is well, they had to get to Turkey somehow, and this is something that people have been telling me on the ground here as well, that was happening. But almost certainly the oil companies will be behind this, because again, the PKK threatens their interests. We did talk about the Igari Mountains region, and this is like one of the front lines of the battle, where the Peshmerga forces have been making contact with PKK fighters. Now, this is an area where the PKK has bases and pretty much controls, but it's also an area rich in oil. And I spoke to a guerrilla fighter last week who was saying, look, this is very obviously the motivation is to get their hands on the oil of this region. What they said, but for the oil companies to develop this region and extract the oil, they're going to have to chop down thousands and thousands of trees, acres of land, and they'll cause all of this environmental damage and pollution. And she explained to me, well, our movement is opposed to that, because one of the fundamental principles of our movement and the PKK's movement is a protection of the environment and not causing more damage and destruction. So, of course, the PKK stand in the way of that. And as we've seen in many other kind of areas where guerrilla fighters are defending ancestral land or from mining companies, it's a similar situation here. And there, as we know in those areas, that the mining companies and the gas and oil companies often hire paramilitary forces or even government forces to carry out actions to try and rid the region of people that stand in their way. So while they're not explicitly saying yes, we're supporting this war, they'd be very foolish to do that. I'd be incredibly surprised if they weren't lurking in the background, putting the strings somewhere.
I've suddenly found that there's lots of questions being sent to me, so I'm going to have to ask them some questions for various people now. So from Vladimir van Wilgenberg, my question is, how is the PUK dealing with PKK and pro-PKK protests now? So the relationships between the PUK and the PKK.
That's quite, yeah, I mean, that's quite an interesting one, that relationship, because of course Erdogan and the KDP often criticise the PUK and said that, you know, the PUK and PKK work in tandem. They accuse them of, you know, working together in Soleimani, but I mean, it's not, I don't think it's really the case. The PUK, at the moment, the PUK are listening to the calls for for unity and to stop the war. So, but when the demonstrations that we're on in Soleimani are obviously being subjected to pressure and this clampdown. But this is one of the things that PKK is quite often says, that is that there's this effort to drive a wedge between the PUK and PKK. Now, look, I'm sure that there are. There's this is real politics, and there will be political and pragmatic decisions that are made, and there will be some very, very obvious differences between the organisations. At the moment, at this particular moment in time, the main thrust from all of the opposition parties, not just PUK but Goran movement and the other forces on the ground, is this unity to stop the war. That's not to say that the PUK are going to be allied with the PKK and welcome them with open arms. I'm sure in different circumstances that situation will be dealt with differently. But at this particular juncture, the main aim is to stop bloodshed, and I think that brings them together in common cause at the moment.
We've got another question from Rushin Bardash, who's not able to use the mic. When do you think will be the time for Erdogan to stop involving in different countries' instabilities and occupying places like Afrin? Do you think Erdogan will stop his attitudes towards neighbourhood countries in Kurdistan?
No.
Is that stop invading everywhere, right, left, and centre? Not before 2023, is he?
I mean, when he'll stop when imperialist countries decide that he will stop, and he'll stop when they stop backing him. He'll stop when the people of Turkey rise up and overthrow him, or he's removed from power somehow. But he's in some ways he's an erratic character, but in others he's very pragmatic, and he's very clever in how he plays different forces off against each other, whether it's Russia or the US. But to think that he operates independently, I think is it's not something that I particularly believe. He's kept in power because the reason the imperialist countries like Britain and the US fail to speak out about what he's doing, I mean, you look at what's happening just to the HDP, a legal social democratic political party, and 16,000 of its members have been detained. 6,000 of them have been jailed. 200 elected officials. 7 MPs rotting in prison. More than 50 directly elected mayors have been removed from their posts out of 65 won by the HDP in municipal elections last year. This is the biggest attack on a social democratic party, I think, since the Second World War. You've not seen it anywhere, but you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it because nobody's speaking about it in Britain. The government isn't speaking about it. The Labour Party isn't speaking about it either. But he's getting away with the internal repression. As Sarah said in her introduction, the biggest jailer of journalists anywhere in the world, a third of the world's total. So, and even those that are outside of prison are, self-censoring for fear of being detained. I work very closely with journalists in Ankara, and we're in daily contact. And they're under incredible, intense pressure. And then we know about the war crimes in Afrin, the use of chemical weapons, the funding of jihadists, jihadist organisations, sending jihadists into Syria. I mean, this is absolutely astonishing. that this is carrying on without any kind of criticism. There's mild criticisms, but all of the forces of imperialism, NATO, the UN, Britain, the United States, they tolerate Erdogan because he's their battering ram in the region, and geographically, Turkey sits in a very important place because it borders areas where they want regime change. Syria, Iran, Iraq, which are all areas that have, of course, lots of oil, but these forces want to see regime change there. They can't get that if there's a free and democratic Turkey, so they don't support a free and democratic Turkey, because a free and democratic Turkey, where these critical voices aren't jailed and there isn't the oppression that there is, would raise the people that are raising that anti-war and anti-Erdogan voice. So they need Erdogan to do that in a way to advance their imperialist aims. So would he stop? No, he's not going to stop until he's removed from power one way or another. Absolutely not. Until imperialist forces stop backing him and we stop selling him weapons.
Do you think there's any sort of awakening and realization of quite what they're backing from people in Europe when you see when they're seeing Erdogan so supportive of jihadist groups, and we've got a growing fear of jihadi terrorism here in Europe? Do you think that the balance is at all tipping in attitudes in Europe?
I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe slightly. I mean, Macron has opportunistically tried to, portray. He's sort of trying to portray himself as a friend of the Kurds, and he's having this fallout with Erdogan over. I mean, his spat with Erdogan has been going on for quite a long time. It started, if you remember, in Libya, and there were clashes between Turkish ships and French warships, and of course Libya is another place where Turkey had shipped jihadists and weapons and all sorts of things in breach of an arms embargo. And that, I don't know whether it is. I mean, it should do. It should be causing great alarm, but the people know. This is the thing. If we're talking about people, the people are, when you talk to them, they're very well aware of the nature of Tayyip Erdogan. Governments know already. They're very well aware of what's happening. They see the same things that we do, and the difference is that they don't care about it. Whether the tide is turning against him, we'll see. I'm not convinced. I think what is news today will be forgotten about very, very quickly. And they like we said, this kind of mutually dependent relationship with the KDP. It's the same with Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. He needs imperialists to keep him in power, and the imperialists need him to carry out his oppressive actions in order to destabilise the countries they want to invade. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully.
Despite all Macron's criticisms of Erdogan, France has also massively taken the opportunity to criticise the PKK again. So
exactly, yeah.
What weight do you give? What weight do you give to Erdogan's ability to release immigrants into European Union countries, and the pressure which populations in Western Europe might put on their governments? I mean, you've got idiots around like Nigel Farage who like to stir this sort of stuff up, and Erdogan in Turkey says, we'll open up the gates and we'll send immigrants into the European Union. Do you give much weight to that as a consideration which Western governments are giving to this? That's a question for you, Steve. Oh, he's frozen on us. Maybe I'll have to repeat that all again.
It's certainly at the conference.
I got the.
You got it, yeah?
Yeah, I got it. I mean, Erdogan does this quite often. That's his sort of go-to position when he's upset with Europe or he wants something, is he threatens to flood Europe with the hordes of migrants from Syria. But of course, there's fewer Syrian migrants in Turkey now because they shipped a load back into Syria when they decided it was a safe haven all of a sudden. And you saw the horrendous things where people were being rounded up on the streets of Istanbul. Istanbul, obviously, that was won by the CHP, the Kemalist Imamoglu, who's, you know, there's been horrendous things like neighbours reporting on Syrian. I mean, that was one of the biggest the deal of shame that the EU signed with Erdogan to keep refugees off their borders. And people, you know, when I've been inside, I'm banned now, but when I was in Van province, people were saying, well, you know, the European Union couldn't care less about refugees. This money, this £3 billion, why don't they let refugees in and keep the money themselves and use it and spend it to actually help people and help the refugees in the European Union countries? Instead, what they're doing is giving all of these, you know, this billions of pounds to Erdogan, which he's using to bomb people with. I guess it's a threat that that he uses that does frighten European Union officials, I suppose, because, you know, the scaremongering about refugees, how serious he is and how quickly he could do it. I'm not sure. He has tried it, but, you know, when he opened the border with Greece, but then the Greeks mobilised. So. Whether he'd be successful in unleashing the hordes, as he horrendously puts it, and Nigel Farage, you know, the language that he uses, I don't know.
I think Rosa wants to put a question. Rosa? Rosa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself?
Hiya, hello, hi. Sorry, I had technical issues there. Hi, Steve. Good to see you. Thanks for the talk. I just was wondering if you've been in touch with other left parties in south of Kurdistan, in Slemani especially. That was my question. If you've been in touch with them.
Yeah. I've been in touch. I've been in touch with some of the parties. Particularly, obviously, the Communist Party of Kurdistan, Iraq, as it's called, which is, I'm a communist. And you know, at the moment, like I said before, the main drive is against war. And all that they had a meeting with KNK, the Kurdistan National Congress, were invited into their offices in Erbil on the 15th, and I've lost track of days, which I believe was Sunday. And they have made a statement very clearly against the war as well. And they're saying, look, that this is not the way to resolve any issues. Any issues must be resolved through dialogue. And you know, this is the thing that's bringing everybody together at the moment. So all parties are singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, which one thing that the KDP has managed to do is bring this unity across parties that have often been very kind of divided. But some of the smaller left parties, I've come across as well, because they've been on the demonstrations. Some of them were before the bigger anti-war protests and the week of events. So, but everybody's kind of united. It's the thing that really is difficult is why now? What suddenly happened that's triggered this need to drive to war? And the PKK have held those positions, as Sarah said in her introduction, for 40 years, more than 40 years. And they've been operating in the region. They've joined the fight against ISIS. So what has happened now? And we do know that obviously the US has been holding meetings. It came in August and it held meetings in Baghdad. It held a meeting in Slemani and Erbil with all of the political parties, including PUK, to try and kind of drum up support for Turkey's military operation and the KDP's action. But all the left parties, all of the other parties that aren't the KDP are united in this. So.
Thank you. We've got a question from Facebook from Elisa Pizzi, and about what's the current situation about water resources and water assets in Rojava. So across the border there.
Oh, right, in Rojava. Oh,
yeah.
Right, okay. I mean, Turkey has been using water as a weapon, not just in Rojava as well, but also in this region, and it's allied with with Iran to withhold water supply here, which is of course causing great damage. And we know in Rojava, in Hasaka, they were controlling the water supply there, and they were cutting it off for days, and they're using water as a weapon in all areas, even internally, as we know, with the Ilisu Dam project and the flooding of Hasan Kaif, which was this cultural genocide against Kurds, but also makes it very much harder for PKK to operate in those regions as well. But of course, in Rojava they were manipulating the water supply. I don't know what the current situation is. I mean, the last I was reporting on it was the critical time during the summer period, which is, of course, when water supply is needed the most. And there was, the very real fear, and officials were talking about and I think the United Nations actually did say something about this and criticised Turkey for switching off the water during the COVID-19 pandemic, because obviously water was essential during that, and they were saying that the lack of water is causing would cause COVID-19 to spread like wildfire across the region. As the current situation, Turkey has been doing this for many years, so it's I think at the moment it's not using water, it's using bombs at the moment, and that's its main drive. But there are other people that will know probably a little bit more detail about the current situation on water. But again, it was certainly something. There was a big fundraiser to support the self-sufficiency of water in the region. I think some of the Kurdish organisations raised a lot of money over the summer to help with that. But yeah, there are organisations that would know the latest on that.
I have a feeling that the authorities have managed to get round it and get water to places. But
they did, yeah. They did over the summer. They definitely got the water switched back on and water supply running again.
If no one else has got a question, I'd like to ask you another question. That the voices that seem to be very quiet in all this is the CHP, and I mean, they sort of say, they put out statements which sound like a lovely foreign policy, but then of course we know that whenever there's actually war, they don't dare speak against it and are thoroughly supportive. So I was wondering if they've said anything about things at the moment.
What is the CHP?
CHP is the oldest political party in Turkey. It was Ataturk's party is the forerunners of that. So they're Kemalists. They say that they're the biggest opposition party in Turkey, but that depends on your definition of opposition. They kind of tail the ruling Justice and Development Party, Erdogan's party, in pretty much everything they do. So, for example, the CHP CHP has supported the war in Afrin. The CHP supported the lifting of immunity from prosecution for lawmakers, which led to the HDP MPs being thrown in prison. Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the mayor of Istanbul, has made some incredibly racist comments about Syrians living in the city and changing the fabric of society. So, there's been a lot of analysis of the nature of Kemalism over the years, and there's Ibrahim Kaipakaya, for example, described them as fascists, as a fascist organisation, and they've certainly been involved in the oppression of Kurds over the years. They were responsible for the Dersim massacre. It was CHP who were behind the Armenian genocide, of course, as well, and they're complicit in what's happening today with the oppression of the Kurdish people. Sometimes they have a few left-wing or sort of more left orientated MPs that do speak out on the Kurds, but they tend to find themselves isolated figures within the party. I'm not aware that they've spoken out about against a war in Kurdistan. I mean, they aren't exactly the biggest supporters of PKK. They tend to change their attitudes slightly when it's election time, and they'll do things like go and visit Selahattin Demirtas, who's the co-chair, the co-leader of the HDP, who's in prison, and they'll sound off a lot, but in action they support pretty much every single move made by the government. So they're completely complicit in not just the oppression of the Kurdish people, but they're also completely complicit in the crushing of democracy and the attacks on journalism, the attacks on all layers of society, in the country, the trade union movement, etc., etc. So, can we look to them for some kind of opposition? It would be a first.
I couldn't find anything when I looked at their website this afternoon anyway. So we've got another question from Facebook, so from Rawat Taha. Turkey says Erbil is a Turkish city with Kirkuk and Mosul. Do you think Baghdad will get involved in these areas to stop Turkey from influencing them?
Not at this stage, no, because I think Baghdad has its own problems at the moment because there's huge internal strife in the central Iraqi region. Of course, the militias are running amok, and there's anti-government protests that are shaking the country again. And there's been these huge uprisings of people. It was the anniversary of the Baghdad uprising, the October uprising, very recently. So they're, on the one hand, they're trying to contend with that, but the what I was talking about earlier, this kind of Sunni corridor that is they're trying to be built, which involves Kirkuk, it involves Mosul, it involves Shengal, to kind of divide progressive Kurds and the Kurdish movement in Bashur in Iraqi Kurdistan and Rojalat in Iran from Rojava. They're colluding together. So Iraq is in cahoots with Turkey. The deal that I mentioned about the so-called security deal over Shengal, which was drawn up behind the backs of the population there, was a deal that was made by the KDP and Baghdad, but it was made at the behest of Turkey. So this was, Turkey were in favour of this. They were pulling the strings because it suits them. So I don't think Baghdad are going to get involved in this. I haven't, I'll be incredibly surprised. They very rarely do. But if they did, they would be supportive of Turkey. That's very clear. But the Iraqi central government is incredibly unstable as well. So I don't think it really has the ability to do anything particularly. Although it does have its forces in Kirkuk and Mosul, of course.
And they're coming up to an election relatively soon as well, aren't they? The Iraqi government.
Yeah. Yes.
Any more questions from anybody? We've got a comment from Chris Scurfield that it's ironic that the KDP is seeking division and conflict, but are only gaining unity against them.
Cool.
Just comment really, rather more than a question. But...
I froze again, I think.
Sorry, a comment from Chris Scurfield that it's ironic that the KDP is seeking division and conflict, but the result is that they're only gaining unity against them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly ironic. It has brought all of the opposition parties together against them. I'm struggling to see how they're going to find a way out of this, really. I mean, I don't think they want to find a way out, but if they did, I mean, it would be how that they can withdraw themselves from this drive to war without Barzani having egg on his face, because there is this mass opposition to what they're doing. He's got no support anywhere, from the opposition parties. More importantly, the people of Kurdistan oppose it, and this is why they're having to bypass the Kurdish regional government. They would never get any kind of sanction for war against the PKK, through the government, through the parliament. So they're in a very tight spot, really, in that respect. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens afterwards.
So do you think that there is being an attempt made to give Barzani an honourable way out, or do you think the only way that we'll see a peaceful solution is if he's actually loses power.
That's a, you know, I think that there needs to be maximum pressure exerted on Barzani internationally. That's that's one of the things that can avert the war. And like I said, we have this APPG which needs to raise its voice against war. But people are very on the ground are saying to me,
can you?
The All-Party Parliamentary Group. Have a look at it on. It has a web page. It has a Twitter account, and please get involved, get stuck in, and ask them to raise their voices against war, because at the moment they're not even talking about it or acknowledging the situation on the ground. They're not even acknowledging that it's happening. So I mean that there needs to be this critical mass that we have here, and like people are saying to me, that's the key. That's the key here. And when we build a critical mass in Britain, that that does pressure the government, and it raises the anti-war voices need to be raised. That's the only thing that people should be concentrating on at the moment. Whether it's the APPG, whether it's journalists in the region, whether it's politicians, that must be their overriding priority. Has to be to avert war, because it will be a bloodbath. Like I said in my opening, 30,000 people, at least, this is a conservative estimate, died in the last so-called intra-Kurdish war between the PUK and KDP in the mid-90s. And, we don't want a repeat of that. Nobody wants to see that, that pointless bloodshed happening again.
Margaret, got your hand up? Unmute yourself, Margaret, can you? You should be able to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. If we ever get this squatter out of the White House, what do you think about regime change in America? Do you think it will make any difference in a positive way? With regard,
I think regime change in America would be a great thing. I just don't think Joe Biden's really the figurehead for that. No, I mean, Biden is a continuity president. He's a Wall Street candidate. He's already said that not much is going to change under his presidency. He's sought to reassure big business and the oil companies and everybody that nothing much is going to change. I mean, there may be some minor cosmetic differences. He won't be as objectionable as Trump, that's for sure. And he certainly hasn't. Certainly the defeat of Trump was an important thing in weakening the far right in America, which we'd seen suddenly on the rise, and we've seen the movements against that, which have been spectacular. Internationally, I very much doubt we'll see any change. I don't think. People aren't overly optimistic. On the ground, on the ground here, I don't think. And we have to remember he was vice president when Obama was running the show, and Obama had a horrendous, there's a sugarcoating of his tenure in office that makes, that people think he was this wonderful, liberal, really great guy. But you look at his record, it was appalling. If Obama apologized for every civilian that he killed in drone strikes, one a day, it would take him 3 years. So he was, his foreign policy was horrendous. Look up Operation Timber Sycamore. So Obama and Biden was behind this as well, supported a covert CIA operation which funded billions of pounds into to jihadist groups in Syria. So the very jihadists that were killing Kurds. So Biden certainly isn't a progressive. He's there's no that they. It would have been different under Bernie Sanders. I think it's fair to say that would have, you'd have seen a real difference in foreign policy there. But Biden has already sought to reassure people that there isn't going to be much change. I mean, there may be, he may go back into the Joint and Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. He may go back into that, which would be a positive thing. But in terms of America's regional interests, they still remain the same, and Biden's going to be pushing them forward. If he wasn't pushing them forward, he wouldn't be president. I don't know. That's my pretty grim assessment of the region. He has, of course, made thundering, criticisms of Erdogan whilst he was in opposition. But we'll see how that pans out when he actually, takes up the hot seat. I very much doubt things will change, but we'll see. The first thing that they could do is remove. Remove the three, Jamil Bayek, Murat Karayelyan, and Duran Kalkan. He could remove them from the CIA's most wanted list and remove the bounty on their heads. That would be a test of what his policy is going to be. He won't.
Yeah, don't put money on that one. I was wondering, the other power, sort of one of the other powers in the region, very much in the region, is Iran, and what's their view, and if they're meddling in this either one way or the other.
Oh yeah, they're definitely meddling in it. I don't think that's even a great secret. Like I said, on my trip into Kandil, there were Iranian forces waiting for us over the ridge of the mountain, and when we drove back from Kandil in the night time, there were big flashlights on the top of the mountains where Iranian forces were operating. But they've also been invited into the region. I mean, there's Iranian forces, like anti-ISIS forces, that are operating checkpoints. The Iranians held my passport for 8 days when I was in Makhmur. So they're very much involved in this. And as we know, in September, they signed up to this joint agreement with Turkey and KDP to deal with, I think they said deal with terrorists, but they meant PKK. I'm not sure if they explicitly said. Oh, no, they did. The Americans said you need to work together to deal with the PKK. So, of course, the Iranians are involved in this. As per usual, they have a great they're involved in many things in the entire of Iraq as well. I mean, this is but yeah, undoubtedly they're involved, and of course they're involved in the oppression of Kurds in Rojalat as well, and the killing of Kolbars and the arresting and detention of Kurds there. They're up to their necks in it too. No doubt.
So were they part of the deal that the United States was involved in? Iran.
Yeah, that was part of the security deal. So they've got forces in. They have forces in. I mean, I think they've always had them there, really. But I mean, they have forces in Kandil. They have forces internally. So yeah, this was part of the deal. This is what I'm saying, that this is not just an intra-Kurdish war. This is an imperialist war, and this has been cooked up. This has been cooked up by the US, by Turkey, by Iran, by the KDP, and I imagine that there are other players involved. But this is the forces of imperialism colluding to try and crush the Kurdish freedom movement. That's their aim. They have differing interests in at different times, but they often overlap. And like I said, US imperialism wants to crush the ideology of the PKK and socialism or whatever however they brand it. So they want to crush that, while the Turkey wants to crush wants the genocide of the Kurdish people, as does Iran too. So yeah, they all have interlinking interests, but yeah, they're very much involved in this.
So have you got time for 2 more questions, Steve?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of them here. So can you tell us about the relationship? Hope you're still there. You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Sorry, you vanished.
My battery's just going. Yeah. No.
Can you tell us about the relationship between Erdogan and Russia in terms of allowing Erdogan to invade Rojava and Afrin in particular? So the relationship.
Well, again, this is quite a complex question, and the Syrian conflict is very, very complex, where you have at some stages you have the Russians bombing Turkish-backed jihadist forces, and then it's who controls the airspace, and are Russia allowing? That was the big thing about whether it was Russia that was allowing Turkey to invade Afrin as well. But I think that it's a very, very complex situation, and the American soldiers have again moved in. They wanted to protect the oil fields, and the American forces attacked the Russians, and there's been all sorts of things happening. But this is where I said Erdogan is quite shrewd when it comes to this, because he'll play the Russians and the Americans off against each other. What the Russians would gain by allowing Turkey to bomb Afrin, I'm not entirely sure, but it would probably be something to do with having more of an influence than America does in the region, because the Russians are backing Assad's forces there. So they have, again, overlapping interests at times, but conflicting at others. So it's a very messy, very, very messy situation. And even the peace talks are even kind of split, where the Russians will allow representatives from the Kurdish movement as part of their peace talks, and the US are saying no, we won't allow them to discuss the future of Syria. So the Americans who are supporting them on the Kurds on the ground are blocking them from discussions around the future. So it's a very contradictory and complex situation, I think, and one that who knows what the answer is.
And then a final question, which I think is a good one to end on, actually, that you've already, so Hannah Cameron asks that you've already mentioned the people of Bashar being against an inter-Kurdish war. So how strong is that anti-war feeling, and especially how strong is it in Erbil, in the more KDP area?
I mean, it's very strongly felt across the region, and people are united. Like I've said, all the political parties, all the Kurdish people are united against the war. There's only one, and like I said, one family pretty much driving it. In terms of how they're able to express that, it's different in different areas. Of course, there are demonstrations which are across the region. It's much harder to do that in Erbil, because this is controlled by KDP, and anybody that's critical of the government, it faces the risk of being arrested. And of course, you have the internal security forces which are monitoring the demonstrations as well. So it depends on the area, to the relative strength of the public expression of the anti-war sentiments. But it's very much there. I can feel it. I can only talk for Slimani, because that's where I'm based, and you can feel it very, very much so here. Erbil, I think, would be slightly different, although I imagine that people there don't want a war either. What I would just say is, it's while there is this anti-war sentiment here, we need to raise those voices, and those voices need to be heard internationally, because I'm sure people in Britain don't even know what's happening and what's on the cards. Many people will be completely unaware that there's about to be another bloodbath here, and we have to make sure that we have a duty, I think, to raise those voices, and that must be the overriding goal of everybody, and every effort has to be put into this, from whether it's, like I said, journalists, politicians, anti-war groups, campaign organisations, trade unions. Really have to mobilise, and that's how we're going to stop the war. Thank
you very much, Stephen. I think you're disappearing from us, so I don't know if you're still there. I'm still here, but yeah. Thank you very, very much. And yes, so basically tell everybody what's happening, and particularly raise with any organisations that you're involved with, like trade unions. Go see your MP or write to your MP, whatever we can do to just make people more aware, to make it that much harder for this war to go ahead. So thanks everybody again for being here, and thank you, Steve. And we look forward to reading all your future reports. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Shabash.
Shabash.
Shabash.
Shabash.